Please welcome our next speaker, John Kimball, a demand planning consultant. Today, he will be presenting Spotlight on Inventory Management. Please stick around after John's session for a live Q&A.
And welcome to Spotlight on Inventory Management. It's good to be with you today, and I'd like to ask you a question. How many times have you been out of stock, especially during this pandemic era? Well, I'm here today to help you learn about how to deal with that kind of problem as well as others. Hi, I'm John Kimball, Senior Consultant with Absolute Value, which provides a demand planning solution to a broad range of customers. And over the course of the next 30 to 40 minutes, I'll share with you some of what we have learned and maybe some best practices for inventory management as well. Your customer has an expectation for when you're supposed to deliver. And if you have a long lead time to your customer and a relatively short lead time from your vendor, there's not a whole lot you need to do with forecasting. You can respond very quickly because you can get what you need for your customer to support what his needs are very quickly. On the other hand, if you have a short lead time from your customer and a long lead time from your vendor, you're going to need to do some forecasting. So how do we go about that? Usually, people begin with their sales history. If you sold a lot of an item, you're probably going to want to stock that item. So you can use history for that to begin with. If you have items that are going away and then replaced by a brand new item, that history is a little different. You want to make sure that you redirect the usage from the old item to the new item. So you have to use history wisely when you're doing forecasting to make sure that history is ready to be used for forecasting. Now, you may have items that are not replacing anything, but they're brand new. They're brand new and they're a lot like an existing item. In that case, you probably want to clone the usage from an existing item to the new item. And that way you've got a forecast for the brand new item day one. And then there are going to be examples where you just don't have enough history. You don't have enough history to forecast, and we're going to need to find a way to address those items. You do want to stock them, but you just don't have enough history to forecast. And then there's going to be times when you want to make usage adjustments. Sometimes it makes sense to adjust usage, maybe automatically smoothing, to bring the highest and lowest periods of sales within a defined reasonable range, say no more than 300% or no less than 20% of the average of the past 12 months. Or maybe there's just a large customer order that you want to exclude from usage. So the sales history is helpful, but you're going to want to build some historical usage that is good input to your forecast engine. So looking at stock or non-stock, you want to make sure, right, that you have inventory that you can sell, right? There's no sense in investing inventory in something that's not going to be something you're going to sell anytime soon. So, and you also want to make sure that you don't spend time trying to forecast something that you're not going to sell. So the resources can be better utilized by making sure that you've got good definition of what's stock and what's non-stock. So a way to do that is to have an objective management rule, something that everybody can use to say, if it meets this criteria, we should stock it. And if it doesn't meet this criteria, then we shouldn't stock it. So what we found is setting up a rule, something like this is very, very helpful. Let's review the last 12 periods, and let's see if we've shipped 6 times. And if we've shipped at least 24 units, then we should call this item a stock item. That's one set of rules that you might use to define something that's stock or non-stock. Now, what you define as stock today may not be stock in 6 months. So you need to continually re-review and reassess what is stock and what's non-stock. Having said that, having criteria is one important thing to have to be able to define stock and non-stock. But there are going to be times when management says, we need to stock this because if we have this item, it allows the sale of other items. or we need to have this item because it is part of a market that we want to grow. It's part of the strategic direction of the company. So we're going to decide to stock these items. So you need the ability to have both, to have the ability to use criteria to define stock and non-stock, and then to have a management override that says we need to stock this item. Now, how do we handle items, as I said, that don't have a whole lot of usage? Here's an example where this item doesn't have a lot of usage. We sold 10 last month, 8 5 periods ago, and 6 10 periods ago. So we would call this sporadic usage. How do we handle that? Well, one way is to set up an inventory target to say we're going to keep some level of inventory for this item we know we want to stock. We know we can't forecast it, but we're going to start with something simple. We're going to take an average of the periods that we do have. In this case, we have a total of 24 units we sold, divided by the 3 periods that we have, and said, all right, the average is 8. Now, based on the number of periods of usage, you can set a different usage multiplier. So management has the ability to say, the input to say, all right, if it's 3 periods, we're going to have a 3-period multiplier times that average. So in my example here, the multiplier is 1.5. So we want to keep 12 in stock. Now, if it was 4 periods or 2 periods, we'd have a different multiplier. So this is one way where management can say, as the usage changes and as the number of periods change, we can have a different target stock. So in this example, we want to have 12. The inventory is 8. And so if we have 12 as our target, 8 in inventory, we only need to order 4. So this is easy to understand. It is dynamic, and it takes advantage of the very, very little data that we do have. Now, for those things where we do have history, all right, then we can use something called the best fit formula selection. This is one approach that we found very, very useful. And all we're doing is repeatedly testing a number of forecast formulas using the history that we do have to come up with a formula that has the least amount of error. And when we look at this, we want to make sure that as history changes, we continually go back and say, let's revisit and make sure that we shouldn't use a different formula now that history has changed. So that's a constant reassessing, a constant relook to make sure we've got the best forecast. And what it's doing is it's saying, let's have history speak to us. Let's have the patterns that we see coming out of history become the forecast for the future. So there's no need for somebody to decide this is a seasonal item or this is not a seasonal item. And let's take a look at how we might do best fit forecast formula. So in this graph, what we're looking at, this slide, we're looking at, we know what we sold last period. We can use the history prior to last period to forecast the last closed period. So in this example, we've got a 6-month formula. We're going to use those 6 months, LP1 through LP6. We're going to come up with a forecast, compare it to the actual, and calculate what the forecast error is. Then we're going to step back and do the same thing. We're going to look and say, all right, what's the forecast if we forecast using LP2 through LP7, come up with a forecast, compare it, get a forecast error, and do it a third time. Now we've got 3 forecast errors. Well, a reasonable approach would say that formula probably would have the median error as an error percentage. And this way we could do the same thing with the second formula. This time we've got 8 periods. We're going to forecast it 3 times. We're going to get 3 forecast errors. And we're going to say, well, a reasonable approach again is to say the median error is the error we would expect to get with formula B. Now we wouldn't just do this with 2 formulas. What we found very useful is to do this with 18 formulas. And then from that 18 formulas, look at that formula that had the lowest median error and use it to forecast. In this way, history is really speaking to us, saying we've tested these formulas, and this is the pattern of usage that we see for this item in the future. And then we don't have to decide whether something's seasonal or non-seasonal. The system will tell us. So we don't have to use smooth usage. We can use actual usage. And what it might look like is something like this. Here in this graph I'm showing, you can see a pattern of usage. This thin line is the historical usage going back in time, and the dark blue is the forecast going out into the future. And notice how it has fit the pattern of the future. It fits the pattern of what the past has looked like, so that we have history really speaking to us, saying this is the pattern we should expect to have for a forecast in the future. Now, the second thing we can learn from this is we can set up our safety stock days. Let's say we set a safety stock days of 30 days. As we approach that peak season, we're going to ask to have more inventory, because 30 days prior to a large peak is more inventory than 30 days as we move into the lower periods of forecast. So that's a great way to set the dynamics of forecasting to go with the dynamics of inventory management. But there are going to be times when you look at the forecast and you say, well, we really need to adjust the forecast. It's not what we expected it to be. So I'm going to walk you through an example of how we can adjust that manually. And then we want the system in certain cases to automatically change the forecast. And let me show you why. Here we have an example. This is the month of May. We had a forecast of 412, but we said we want to adjust it by 12. And we ultimately ended up with a total adjusted forecast of 721. How did we get there? Well, today is, in this example, May 10th. And as it turns out, after we made the forecast adjustment, we've taken the 412, we brought it to 400. We said, all right, that's our forecast. As it turns out, we actually sold 450 by the 10th. So we way oversold the forecast. We want to immediately add that 50 back in to say, let's plan to have 450 to support the larger sales. But then we also know that we had originally forecast 400, and if there's 31 days in May, it's 12.9 per day. What are we going to do with that? We have 21 days left in the month, right? What are we going to do for the rest of the 21 days? Are we going to sell anything, or are we going to sell some percentage of that 12.9? So that's where management can say, I'm going to set that percentage. In my example here, we're saying it's 100%. So 21 times 12.9 is a 271 forecast adjustment. So we take that 271, we add the 50 that we've already had for an adjustment, and we get a total adjustment of 321. Now we take the original forecast of 400 that we had manually adjusted to come up to a total forecast of 721. So you can see how very quickly we moved from a forecast of 412 with a small manual adjustment, and then we want to have two factors that affect the automatic adjustment. If we're going to sell more than the forecast, we want the system to automatically respond to that. And then if we have, in this case, 21 days left of the month, depending on how many days we have left of the month, and depending on how much of a factor we want to have to add back in, we want to add something back in for the balance of the month. So this is a dynamic way to take advantage of the input from people responding to what's happening in the market. Now, this is an adjustment to the forecast. There may be times when you want to make an adjustment to the usage. All right, when would that happen? Well, in this COVID period, we've had crazy, wild increases and decreases in sales, right? So we've had variations that have happened. So when you look at the history during those COVID months, you look and say, gee, that will never happen again. And we need to make some adjustments. Believe it or not, some customers have had huge increases in sales of certain items during that period, and then other customers have had huge decreases. So what we need to do is look for a typical period we can compare. We can compare and say, all right, we'd like our atypical period, our COVID period, to be more like our typical period, right? So let's pick a typical period, and then we're going to adjust our atypical or COVID period so that it's more typical. So let's walk through an example. In this example, we're going to say we're going to look at the usage in the year of 2018. we're going to look at what is the average usage for all of our items during that year. And then we want to set a bar that says, we don't want the atypical period to be anything less than 30% of that average, or anything more than 250% of what our typical period is. So let's look at an example of how that would work. Here we have an item that had 495 as an average in the year 2018. So 30% of that is 149, and 250% of that is 1,238. So we want to make sure that our usage is in the range of 149 to 1,238. So in January, we sold 386. That's okay. That's within range. In February, it's 128. So that's way below. That's 21 below the 149 mark. So we're going to add 21 in automatically and adjust. 762 is in range. 261 is in range. And then we look at our second item. This one had an average of 26. So my low should be 8. My high should be 65. Looking at the numbers, 18 is okay, 0 is not, we add 8, 12 is okay, and 54 is 8. So what we have is a way to use some rule of thumb, right? Of I want to look at my typical period, and I want to set some boundaries for adjusting my atypical period. And so this is what we found a lot of people are doing, is saying, I'm going to make these adjustments across many items using this typical period as a guide, and my input of my minimum percentage and my max percentage to be able to narrow down how that adjustment is made. So that's an example of when you would make some usage adjustments. Now, you can use history to forecast, and most of the time it's going to work. But there are going to be times when the history is just not good. It's not really the way to forecast that part of your business. And when would that be? When would it be where history is not a good guide for the future sales? Well, if there are key items that the customer is taking action on. Let's say a customer says, we're going to discount this item, or we're going to promote this item, and you look at history and there's no way you're going to know that that's what's going to happen. Only the customer knows. If there's information that is only available from the customer and it's not something you can find in the history, you're going to want to do a collaborative forecast with that customer. But having said that, you still want to be able to forecast the other non-collaborative part of your business. So you want to keep that history separate. You want to separate the collaborative history from the non-collaborative history so that you can continue to forecast that non-collaborative portion of your business. Now, so that would be great to be able to do a collaborative forecasting with your customers. You also want to be able to share as much information as you have with your vendors. And that's a fairly straightforward, easy thing to do by using a time phase plan of what you expect to buy and share that with your vendors. Let's look a little deeper at how we do collaborative forecasting. Here's a flow chart that explains collaborative forecasting with a customer. So what we're going to do is take the history for a customer for only those items that we find are the best items to do a collaborative forecast with. We're going to take the history of those items and run it through our forecast engine to come up with a forecast for just those items and that history for that customer. We're going to bring it to a working collaborative forecast, bring it to Excel, and then in Excel, we're going to share that with our customer or our sales representative and ask them three things. We're going to ask we're going to show him, here's what our forecast is. And then we're going to show him, this is what you bought or we sold to you for the same month last year. And thirdly, most importantly, we're going to share with that customer, here's the forecast that you gave us last month. We're going to ask an important question. Do you want to change it? All right. Tell us what your changes are. Tell us what you think the forecast is going to be for those items based on what you know, and bring that back in Excel, and we'll bring it back to our system. Then we're going to combine it with the forecast for all the non-collaborative usage for one total forecast. So this is one simple flowchart explaining how we do collaborative forecasting for just those items that we pick that we're going to work with for a single customer. So what would that spreadsheet look like? Well, it looks something like this. Here we have 3 items, and for each item, as I said, there's 3 things. Here's what we sold to you last year for the same month, and here's what we're forecasting for the next 12 months by month using our formula, our best fit formula forecasting solution. And lastly, most importantly, on this blue line, we're sharing with the customer, here's the forecast that you gave us last month. What do you want to do? Do you want to change it? Make your changes, save the file, and send it back to us. So this is a fast, easy to understand, gives everybody information that they need to make their decisions, and it shares with you to learn what is the customer going to take action on. Something where you can't have history telling you what's going to happen, because they probably are taking action on these items that are totally separate from anything you might know. Now, when it comes time for a vendor, you want to take some simple steps to say, first, here's the items that we're buying from you. Here's what we think we're going to buy from you in the months that we're going to buy them. And what we want to do is make sure that we take out any inventory that we already have on hand. We want to deduct any open purchase orders. And then we want to show, as I said, in the time when we're going to order it. So this is the quantity that we're going to order. And that quantity should be reflective of any minimums that the vendor has, any multiples, so that it's a most real expression of, this is what we think we're going to buy from you, Mr. Vendor. And this puts the vendor in a really good position to be able to understand what you're going to be buying from him. Of course, you would tell him this is not a commitment, this is a forecast. This is something to be shared with the vendor so that they're much, much better prepared for what's coming down the road. And all of what we're doing is trying to come up with what is the suggested order. Okay, we're using the forecast to bring to the suggested order. And what might a suggested order look like? Well, it might look something like this. Here's the items we need to order. These are the criticals that we have, anything that's checked critical. Now, critical would be something like, well, we don't have enough inventory for the sales orders we have for this item right now. We have more orders than we have inventory. Here's how many we want to order. That's what we need to order to support the forecast. Here's the unit of measure. Here's the dollars that we're going to spend on this item. Okay, that 122 pieces represents that many dollars. If there's a purchase order that already is open, we'd want to know that. Are there any alerts? Things like we've oversold the forecast already, or we have a late purchase order. This is when we should expect to see the goods received if we place the order today. We'd also like to know, is there any surplus available somewhere? Maybe it's not available in this location. Maybe it's available in another location. We want to know that. We want to know, how much does it weigh? Because in certain cases, you may have a vendor target that if you hit a certain amount of pounds weight, you get free freight. So that's helpful to know. What's the weight of what I'm ordering? Also, a vendor might ask you, if you spend a certain amount of dollars, to know what the vendor target is in dollars. It's also helpful. So that dollars is helpful in a number of ways. It's also good to be able to say, well, we're not going to buy it from this vendor this time. I want to be able to override and buy it from a different vendor. That's another thing that's very helpful when you're looking at a suggested order, be able to quickly change and say, I'm buying it from somebody else today for whatever the good reasons are. You'd also like to know, is there any inventory left over for those items where this is what we're seeing here is to buy an item, but its predecessor, right, the item that is going out of stock or is being discontinued, you still have some inventory left over. So it's good to know that there's available inventory from that redirected item. And then some simple things like some ABC codes to say how important is this in terms of annual usage, in terms of dollars, in terms of number of times it appears on sales orders. So this is just one sample suggested order with some really important information that a buyer would probably need to know to place a purchase order. So another question people often ask as they're managing inventory is, do I have too much inventory? And how much of my inventory is extra? So how do I define it, and how do I know how much I have? Well, one way to do that is to measure the inventory against an expected run-out date, right? And then what you want to do is also make that inventory visible for use. So you're measuring it to know how much you have, but you also want to make sure you optimize it. And if I can, I want to prevent a purchase of inventory that we might otherwise be buying and not need. Here's the way that we might define surplus. So in this example, I've got a lead time for an item. I've got a review cycle, right? How often do I review this item? And how many safety stock days? So I add up that number of days, and then I use two factors. The first factor is if I have that horizon plus a management factor of some number of days, any inventory that might last beyond that, I'm going to call surplus. And then I'll have a second factor. If I go beyond this second fence, that second management factor, anything that lasts beyond that, I'm going to call that excess. So that's a simple way with just two management factors of some number of days that go above and beyond the lead time, review cycle, and safety stock days. It says this defines what's surplus and what's excess. And you'd want to recalculate that every day. And as forecast changes, so does the amount of surplus that you have, right? A bigger forecast means, well, we have less surplus. And as the forecast is reduced, well, that run out becomes a different date and you have more inventory. So it's dynamic. That the surplus is dynamically changing with everything else that's changing in the business, especially forecast. So what would we do with that? We'd want a management report that says, here's what our surplus is. And doing it with a graph like this says, here's a pie chart that says, here's what our total inventory is. Here's the good. Here's the surplus inventory, and here's our excess. And by looking at that, it becomes visible, right? So we can manage it, we can measure it. And we want to make sure that if we look at it every month, that number's going in the right direction. So that's a really good, helpful tool. The second thing we want to do is utilize that stock. We want to make it visible so that when you place a new purchase order, that you don't buy inventory that you don't have to, that you apply that inventory, or that you transfer it back to the hub, or you transfer hub to hub. So that's very helpful to make sure that you're using all your inventory. So you don't want to just measure it, you want to use the inventory. Okay? So what we're seeing is what people are looking for is a dynamic demand planning process. This process is something that runs every day looking at demand and supply, using things like best fit formula selection to make sure that as the history changes, the formula may change to say, okay, now we've come up with a better formula for this item, we have a better forecast. And we also look every day to see what do we need to buy? What's our suggested purchases? What are our suggested transfers based on the information that we have today? And when we're doing that, we want to have management's input for how much safety stock days do we want to have, right? That should be based on how management wants to manage the inventory. How often do we review when we're buying from a vendor? What is our minimum and maximum inventory days in each spoke location? That's something management can set. It says we don't want to have anything less than 30 days of inventory or anything less than 2 weeks of inventory and no more than 8 weeks of inventory in our spoke locations. That's something management definitely can have input to say, this is how we want to manage it. What to do if sales are greater than forecast? Another rule that management can say, as we saw in a couple of slides ago, that says if we've exceeded the forecast and we have some days left in the month, what do we do? All right. And then how do we share inventory that's in short supply? If we don't have enough inventory to send all the locations that need it, how do we share that? Those are all important things that are part of our process. This is all a process for managing supply and demand, keeping them in sync and making sure that you're serving your customers the very, very best you can. And if you think of this as a process, you also want to look for how can we do a better job? How can we make this better? And one way to do that is by looking at projected lost sales. By saying, well, I'm going to measure my performance, right? I'm going to see, what is my projected lost sales, and I'm going to measure that day to day first so that I can fix things. So if I see a projected lost sale, maybe I can prevent it. Maybe I can find a way to prevent losing that sale by expediting something or taking some action. But also, I want to find the root cause. I want to find out what caused us to be in a position where we're going to lose sales. So a measure that we might use is a very simple one. Simple measures work, right? We're going to look at what's our on hand divided by our expected sales, right? What do I have and what do I need? And then expected sales should be just the things that we need in the next few days. So it's not going out, months, it's going out maybe 7 days. And with that very low bar, if there's a problem, well, it's probably a real problem, right? There's probably no reason why you don't have what you need in the next 7 days. So where do we begin? Well, we're going to look at all of our items, every single item. We're going to look to see, do we have any lost sales? Well, there's going to be some items where we don't have any forecast, there's no orders. We don't expect to lose anything on those, right? There's nothing that we need. Then there are some items where we have exactly what we need or more. All right, so when we look at our on hand, it's much bigger than our expected sales in the next 7 days. But then there are going to be some items where we look at the on hand divided by the expected sales, and it's less than 100%. We do have some expected sales. Okay, and what do we do with that? We ask why. Why is that happening? What is it that's causing us to be in a position where our process isn't working? We don't have the inventory we're supposed to have. Is it because we have a bad forecast? Do we have some history that we shouldn't be using to forecast? Is that history really not representative of what's going to happen in the future? Did we forget to take out a large sales order? Is there a history we didn't redirect? What is it about that history that's not good, causing us to have a bad forecast? Is there a late vendor? Are vendors delivering late? That would cause a lost sale if you don't have vendors delivering on time. Is that what's going on? Could it be a sales surge? Is there something happening in the marketplace that we could have known if we had asked the right question? How can we learn from this potential lost sale to do better in the future? Or is it just something new? Is it a new salesperson? Is it a new customer? A new product? A new market? A competitive action that's happening? What's going on that's causing us to be in this position? We want to learn from this. Or maybe they're just some bad data. Maybe we're making bad decisions because there's something in our data that's just bad. Every one of these is an example where we can find not only how we can fix the lost sale for the items we're seeing today, but we want to find the common causes that we can change something in our process so that many, many items in the future are not in this position where we have expected lost sales. So it's a great opportunity to make the process better. So in summary, what are we saying? We're saying use history wisely, right? We have the sales history, but sometimes it doesn't represent exactly what we think is going to happen in the future. A discontinued item that's being replaced, we want to redirect the usage. A large sales order that will never happen again, we want to exclude that. If there's if we sold it from a warehouse and it was shipped from a different warehouse, if it wasn't shipped from the right warehouse, maybe we want to redirect the usage to where it should have shipped from. So we want to use history wisely. We want to decide what's stock and what's not stock. Okay, we want to make sure that we're not putting inventory away for sales that we don't expect to get, right? So we want to make a good decision on these things should be stock and these things shouldn't be. It saves us time and money, not only in inventory, but in time spent forecasting. We want to let history speak to us. We want to have the history tell us this is what the pattern is that we should expect to see in the future. And when that doesn't work, when we know, hey, the history is not really going to help us, then we want to collaborate with our customers. We want to ask them, tell us what's going on. Tell us the actions that you're taking and tell us what the quantities are that you think you're going to sell because of those actions. And then if it's good for us to learn to help work with our customers, it's always good to work with your vendors to share with them what you expect to be buying. You put yourself in a position where you're a better customer to your supplier and they become a better vendor sort of magically. You want to manage inventory levels to be in sync with demand. You want to do simple things like let's set safety stock days so that as the forecast goes up, we carry more inventory. As the forecast goes down, we lower our inventory. So we're dynamically flowing and changing with what's going on in the marketplace. And then we want to make sure that we're managing our surplus. We don't want too much extra inventory. So we want to measure it so we see, is it moving in the right direction? And then we want to make it visible. Make sure that before we make a purchase, we decide, well, maybe we're not going to buy all of that what the system is telling us, maybe we're going to transfer some inventory from another location that has surplus and prevent an unnecessary purchase. And then we're going to watch for projected lost sales. Why? Because we want to find ways to improve the process. We want to find opportunities where things aren't going as we expected them to. We want to understand what is it that's happening now that we could fix our process so that we can have a better process in the future. And of course, throughout this whole process of managing the supply chain, you want to include management's rules for how much safety stock do you want to keep? What do we do if we exceed the forecast? What do we do when we have inventory that's not enough for all of our locations? And how do we share that inventory? There's a number of management rules that we can use. So thank you. It's been great being with you today. I've enjoyed my time with you. Thank you for voting with DynamicCon to have me here. Hopefully you've learned a few things, and I'll be live with you in a few seconds to answer any questions and comments you may have through the chat box. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. And I see we have some questions that have come in. I just want to just say a few things before I begin with the questions. And you're probably wondering, we had some questions that came in that said, is this in GP? It's not in GP. You're probably wondering, given that none of what I talked about is in GP, why am I here? What I want to tell you is that we found that a lot of GP users have inventory problems, and we wanted to share with everybody what we've learned, looking at the ideas behind the concepts behind what we're doing, and you can bring some of those home, whether you can incorporate them right away into what you're doing, or honestly, if you were to ask me, the best way to incorporate these ideas would be to have our software, of course. But nevertheless, we've shared with you the ideas of what we found to be successful, and hopefully you found that to be something that you can carry forward. So we look for, if there's any questions, you can send them in now, and I'll respond to those. What I've been talking about is really not just the concepts, but especially focusing on how management can tie in to what's going on in inventory management. That there are decisions that management can make. There are parameters, there are factors that you could set, like how much, what items should be stocked, right? How do you decide what stock? Managing end of life products, like how do we end up, product comes to end of life, and how do we start a new product? How many safety stock days do we want to have? Some basic things that management can set, so you're not really flying blind. So I'm looking to see if we have any questions here. All right. Do you use the inventory transactions as the go-to for analyzing inventory, or do you look at SOP? And those seem to be the GP things, like the POP. I guess that means the sales and operations planning. For analyzing inventory, really, you want to look to see, what is the history of what I've been selling, and is my forecast, looking like it makes sense with what my history is. So that's what I take to be analyzing inventory, because once you have the inventory, there's not a whole lot you can do to not have it, other than make it visible if it's surplus and then apply it where it's needed. Looking for some more questions here. Yeah, I can't answer whether the HITB report is a good starting point, because that's something specific to GP. I'm not really talking about GP. I'm talking about how to manage inventory on a conceptual basis. And yeah, we do partner with a lot of different ERP packages. What you're hearing is the experience that we've drawn on from by using our software. With over 300 different customers, some of which are ERP and some of which are GP, as well as other ERP packages. So your question is, so your tool does not get data directly out of GP tables. Actually, that's a very good question. The data does come directly from GP. What we would do is take exports of specific data on a nightly basis and bring it into our system. That's how it works, so that you're always in sync with GP. Someone saying, do we have white papers to read about the generic topic? You can go to the Absolute Value website, and you'll find some things there. And you're right, this is not ERP specific, but we have worked with GP as well as others. And I'm being told the HT is the historical inventory trial balance. The purpose of the report is to balance your inventory values to the GL account numbers for inventory. Yeah, that sounds like that's in an accounting function. When I'm talking about analyzing inventory, it's making sure that supply and demand are in sync. Any other questions? People are saying, often ask me, well, who uses your software? Anybody who has inventory that they need to manage. So just to name some different kinds of businesses: HVAC, beauty products, personal care products, hardware, medical equipment, wine and beverage. So different kinds of businesses. Looking at your questions here. You said you have 60,000 SKUs. Well, that's also a very good question. We've worked with customers who have, I'm trying to think of a low number and a high number, much higher than 60,000 SKUs, in the hundreds of thousands. So yes, it does scale. Question is, do you look at the pipeline or historical sales? We look at sales. So anytime you ship to a customer, anytime you invoice, that's what we think of as history. Yeah, I can't really speak to Power BI. So people sometimes, a question I've often been asked is, well, how much history do you need to be able to do this kind of best fit forecasting approach? Very simple, 24 months. Usually we look for 24 months, and why? So that we can pick up the seasonality of an item. So thank you for including the link to Absolute Value. You can find that in the chat. And sometimes what we get for a question is how accurate is the forecasting using best fit? And what I'd like to have people think of when they think about the accuracy of the forecasting is, when you're using best fit, what's happening is the system is always looking to come up with a better solution and looking to come up with a better forecast. So it's constantly self-improving. But with the way we do it is we usually present what the lowest median forecast error was for the formula that was selected, so that you always know that. So that's just a couple of things about forecast accuracy. Any other questions? It looks like it's sort of the end of the day, and I thank you all for being here. Thank you for attending, and thank you to our sponsors, DynamicsCon, who made this possible. I hope to be able to come back again, and I've enjoyed the discussion we've had here. we do take some of our concepts and some of our thinking from effectiveinventory.com. You can find that in the chat as well. And thank you all for the kind comments. And if there are no other questions, just wait another couple of minutes here. If there are no other questions, we'll let you get on to the next session or the end of your day. Thank you very much.